Hey everyone, welcome to the Renovation Theory podcast. We are your hosts. I'm Pat, and this is Britt, and this is episode number 1. So this is the first one. We'll give this thing a go. So today we just want to talk about what the podcast is going to be and why we wanted to do this podcast and what we're hoping to do with this and how you can get involved other than just listening, because that's a big part of the podcast, but that's not the whole point of this. So I'll let Brittany start and talk about the problem and why we decided to do this.
Yeah, this is something we've been talking about for a really long time, and I think it comes mainly out of feeling like we've had a lot of conversations, whether with coworkers or friends, where you kind of reach an impasse, or somebody gets angry, or people shut down, or even worse, like going more online. I guess you see people that are kind of taking like that troll mentality, like I'm really trying to win, and that can be both in person or online, but we tend to see it more online, but. Um, and I think it just comes from this slow evolution of losing that interpersonal connection in those interpersonal conversations, and then more and more things becoming like politically incorrect to talk about or whatever the case may be. And we've just kind of lost that skill of being able to have conversations where we really disagree with each other or maybe disagree on certain points. And I think that's just become more and more evident, the longer we've been paying attention to it. But just it's just a big issue that we've seen in our culture.
We've kind of lost the ability to deal with a polarizing issue
Mm-hmm.
in a constructive way. We just continue to make it more and more polarized, and we people get farther and farther entrenched on the sides that they're in,
Yeah.
and anybody that's stuck in the middle, we make them choose a side
Yeah.
often or kind of kick them out of the conversation. And so a lot of this podcast will be us talking about issues,
Mm-hmm.
but a lot of this is we want to hear what you guys think and we want to get your input, because the way we grew up and our background and our beliefs and everything are going to be different from you, and yours are going to be different from anybody else that's listening.
Right.
And so we want to get as many viewpoints in here, even if they do seem to be very, very opposite, and have a place for those conversations to happen in a healthy, non threatening, safe environment where we can often disagree,
Right.
but we can hopefully come to a point where we don't get to the point of just arguing, or
Right.
screaming from the mountaintops, as I heard it said on another podcast.
Yeah, I was just going to bring up that example. I think that's one of the best things that we can see, like visualize that what we're talking about is like you have take any topic that's out there today that has the two polar opposite sides, and that's what you see from everybody is just yelling from either side and yelling, not having a conversation, not you know really calm or anything. It's I'm right, you're wrong, or that's almost best case scenario. Worst case scenario is we're not even having the conversation because we're so frustrated with the yelling. Um, but like you mentioned, I think there's just a ton of gray area and opportunities for us to hear other sides of every argument. And that's really what we want to try to expose in this podcast are what are some alternative ways of thinking about it, or what if we looked at this from a different side, um, or multiple different sides. And so that's really going to be one of our goals.
So it's um, we want to address some pretty tough topics. Not
Hmm.
not every episode will be super tough, but we want to address some of the political stuff happening in the
Hmm.
U.S., especially right now, but in the world, we want to talk about some of the issues that are dividing us on Facebook, whether it's homosexuality or gun control or
Hmm.
immigration. Those are obviously very big ones, and so
Hmm.
we will, handle those with as much care as we can and as are necessary. But we also want to talk about stuff and just set stuff up, like just realizing our biases
Hmm.
and getting ourselves into the right mindset to evaluate our beliefs and our worldview and our faith structure. If you have a faith structure,
Hmm.
there's a certain mindset that we need to get in order to even have these conversations.
Hmm.
And so at least these first few episodes, we're going to be talking less so about a specific issue
Right.
where people disagree, and more so just getting us two on the same page as far as mentality moving forward, being able to open our mind and think about new ways, but also for you guys to get involved and also get into that same mentality. Because if we don't do some groundwork here at the beginning and get on the same page and set the ground rules for how these conversations are going to go and what the goal for these conversations is, then it's not going to go anywhere.
Yeah, and just to kind of, we didn't really, it's actually kind of irrelevant what our like background and stuff is, other than the fact that neither one of us are super political junkies or history buffs, or, we are not the people that are going to be like shoving facts or memorization or stats. I mean, there's definitely going to be part of that where we might bring something into a conversation, but our perspective is these issues are important and they're things that people need to be talking about, and we're going to be willing to open up the conversation and trust that there are some people that have spent more time and have more knowledge and have more insight to bring into the conversation that people need to consider. But that's not our perspective. We're not coming to the table really as experts of any of these things. So a little bit of grace needed for us
A
there,
lot.
because that's not our forte. But then also just you can expect that that's not going to be our perspective either. So
And we don't necessarily need that to be everyone's perspective.
right.
Everyone brushes up against these issues and brushes up against these conversations, whether
Right.
you know the facts or not. So yes, we need people that know the facts because we don't want to be basing our, beliefs and assumptions on complete lies.
Mm-hmm.
But everyone encounters these. And so however you encounter these issues, that's a valid viewpoint.
Mm-hmm.
And we want to open up the conversation to that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh, the only time I've ever thought about this was last week when I ran into so and so at Target.
Yeah.
That's a valid thing to add to the conversation. You may not know any of the facts at that point, it's just your experience, but that's still something that's valid and that we want people to add to the conversation so that they can learn a little bit more and so
Mm-hmm.
that other people can hear their experiences and hopefully that will jog something in their memory or whatever.
Yeah, one other thing I just want to add is, you know, you mentioned like running into somebody at Target, and I think one of the things that we really want to do here is help you be prepared so that when you get into a situation with somebody that you really care about, whether that be a friend or a family member or whatever, you have the skills to answer in an eloquent and prepared and thoughtful way instead of a reaction type way. And I think sometimes that just happens because we haven't processed through like, how am I going to respond if that happens? What do I actually think about this? And what happens if they disagree with me? And so that's part of the thing there too, is just being better people for other people and not responding out of offense or just a guttural reaction that's not actually how we feel about things.
Right. We're not trying to, there will be disagreements for sure
Mm-hmm.
between us and hopefully online a little bit, but we want them to be productive disagreements and we want to tread the line very lightly of argument versus healthy disagreement conversation.
Right.
And so exactly what Brittany was saying, we want to hopefully be able to present an us as a whole community, not just
Mm-hmm.
you and I, but be able to present different ways of thinking about things so that you aren't so reactionary. So you can hopefully cut those arguments off before they get there at family Thanksgiving or family Christmas or
Right.
whatever, but still approach that topic
And not
if
shut it down.
right, if
Yeah.
it comes up. So we don't want to avoid that, but we also want to provide a mindset and some tools for us to have a healthy way of looking at it.
And then also like recognizing, and I think we're going to get to this a little bit talking about our core values, but recognizing when it is a good time to shut the conversation down, and when there's no, I think when there's no receptivity to whatever it is that you're talking about, and there's not a chance for a good conversation. I think that's another thing that we don't necessarily have a good radar for in conversations today, is like, is this person open and receptive and willing to have a good conversation, or are they shut down and screaming from the mountaintops and I just need to be done and walk away from this conversation?
Speaking to a brick wall does nobody any good.
Right.
So we named this Renovation Theory, and that is very purposeful.
Mm-hmm.
We spent a lot of time trying to think of a good name for this. And so the point of, well, if you think of inheriting a house,
Mhm.
um, whether you've bought a house or it was passed down to you, you inherited a house somehow. You have to go into that house and look at everything that's in there. The carpet, the walls, the color of the walls, the structure, you got to get it inspected so that you
Mhm.
know everything works if you want heat and AC and all that. The decorations,
Mhm.
the colors, the design, everything, you've got to look at that and figure out how you want to live in that house.
Mhm.
Whether you want to change some of that stuff or whether you want to keep it, you have to look at that house and figure out what's structural, what can't be changed. You can't really move the foundation without a lot of work, but there are some walls that you can move that you
Mhm.
can even take out.
Mhm.
Sometimes they just need a fresh coat of paint. Sometimes you just need to put a new picture on the wall in the same frame. And our worldview and our faith and our beliefs, no matter what those are like that house. We should be able to look at each individual piece of those and say, this is structural, this is foundational to everything that I believe. If I change this, my whole belief structure goes away.
Mhm.
That's a valid thing. But you also need to realize that some of those things that you thought were foundational, that's just a wall that can be taken out,
Right.
or it might just need a fresh coat of paint. So, in our experience, we both grew up in a conservative Christian home,
Mhm.
in conservative Christian homes, different ones.
Yeah.
um, and so that plays into a lot of our beliefs and a lot of our faith and big into our worldview. And so a lot of this podcast will be us exploring from that perspective, but we want you guys to be able to explore that from whatever perspective you're coming at, whether it's
Mhm.
Christian, whether it's non-Christian, whether it's Jewish, whether it's Muslim, whether it's atheist, it doesn't
Mhm.
matter what that is. Everyone has that sort of core belief structure, and we want to be able to look at those pieces. We want you to be able to look at those pieces and say, maybe I don't need to hold so tightly to this because it's not a foundational belief. And a lot of the stuff that we plan to talk about, the political stuff and um, the societal and cultural stuff, those probably aren't foundational. In some instances, they will be, but a lot of the stuff we're going to be talking about should not be the basis for what we believe a lot of the times.
Yeah, and I think from us that comes from a place of having gone through not all of this, and some of this will be going through in a new way, but like Pat mentioned, we each grew up in conservative Christian homes, and we met at a conservative Christian college, and then had kind of a crisis of faith is maybe a little more than it
Yeah, it's
was,
a little dramatic, but
um but definitely like a kind of renewed sense of like, whoa, is this really what we believe? And that applies to a ton of different areas, largely political and social, but some other ways as well. And really coming to terms with, is it okay for us to say something, to believe something, to live in a way that's really different from maybe our structure growing up and our structure in this school that we both loved going to for a lot of different reasons.
right.
But being able to walk away from that and say, okay, what of these things do I really believe are valid and true and I loved and I want to keep, and what of these things are not that at all? And so, like I said, not that we've really wrestled through every single these top one of these topics that we're going to talk about, but we definitely have kind of done this in our own lives, and I think we all do it whether or not we realize it. I think one of the most obvious ways is like parenting. I'm not a parent, but um, we're not
So,
parents.
so give us some parenting advice.
No, no. Just I think I've seen in my friends who are parents, like they have to go through and say, okay, this is the way my parents did it, but how am I going to do it? And
Yeah.
I think that's a really obvious place that people see that in their own lives, but we don't always do it in other topics in other areas.
Yeah, it's a belief or it's a stance we've held for so long or that was passed down to us, and so
Mhm.
we have a harder time letting go,
Mhm.
and so we think that that's something that we need to hold on to forever.
Mhm.
And sometimes it should be,
Mhm.
but sometimes it doesn't have to be. And so we want to be able to look at that and evaluate everything, whether it's you know, a big issue or whether it's a small issue, and be able to evaluate it. A friend of mine used used a Lego house analogy when I
Mhm.
was talking to him about the podcast and some of the stuff that he's seen. He said your belief structure should be like a Lego house. every piece is individual. So you should be able to grab a piece off of that Lego house, look at it, evaluate it, say, does this really need to be here?
Mm-hmm.
And yes is a valid answer. No is a valid answer.
Right.
Maybe this needs to be on the other side of my Lego house is also a valid
Mm-hmm.
answer. You should be able to put it aside if you don't need it or put it back on your house. All of the things that we believe, each one of these issues, each one of the disagreements that seem to happen on social media are a piece of our Lego houses.
Mm-hmm.
And too often we act like looking at that Lego piece and evaluating it and asking honest, real questions about that issue are going to cause our Lego house to crumble.
Right.
And if that's the case, then we need to re examine what we're building our Lego house on.
Mm-hmm.
But we should be able to evaluate that stuff, whether it's faith related or whether it's society related, or whether it's cultural
Yeah.
related, no matter how long it's been here. We want to be able to ask those questions and evaluate that issue honestly.
Yeah. And we want to do it with more than just ourselves. So
Yes.
that's always been a big goal for us with this podcast is okay, how do we find more people that are interested in having conversations in this way? And then how do we have a community that's productive and that doesn't fall into a lot of the same traps that Facebook comments and um whatever other place that you may find discussions, office conversations, or whatever family Thanksgivings can fall into. How do we avoid those? How do we find a similar set of people and attract those people into this conversation, and then have sort of a set of ground rules to facilitate those? And so that's we spent a lot of time talking about core values, and I am currently working at a company that really strongly uses core values, and I've seen firsthand how that can really unite our culture. And it basically helps us understand what values are we going to reward and what values are we going to try to stamp out or have less of. And so we kind of always knew that that was going to be a piece of this
Mhm.
community and kind of our structure around trying to find people, like we said, that have a similar mindset. So we wanted to kind of go through those with you today and kind of break each one down, talk about why and what they mean. And, they're just little quick snippets, but, there's a lot to them and a lot to why we chose them. So we wanted to talk about that a little bit.
Yep. So our first core value is value everyone without condition. And there was a reason we chose this one as the first core
Mm-hmm.
value, because everything else falls apart if we don't do this.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the arguments that are happening on social media, on Facebook, on online, in person,
Yeah.
ultimately come down to I'm digging my heels in, and if you disagree with me, I'm giving myself permission to think of you
As less
as
than
less.
human. Yeah.
As less if it's a big issue, often less than
Yeah.
human, depending on the issue.
And I've seen so many places where I am just shocked at what people are willing to say because there's a barrier of a computer between them. And I've heard a lot of people say this idea of like, well, people wouldn't say that if they were face to face. And I just think, well, like that's not an excuse. Like it's still a person on the other side. And I think that's something that we're really gonna hold people to in this community is like, if you can't come to the table and say, I value everybody equally. I value everybody without condition, without stipulations that they have to look a certain way or make a certain amount of money or have a certain amount of intelligence or whatever. Then you're going to have a hard time in our group because that's just a set of value or a value that we just believe is absolutely essential. And
Everyone has something to contribute,
yeah,
no matter how involved in this conversation they've been in the past or how much they've brushed against this
hmm
issue. Everyone has something to contribute, and we want it to be a safe place for everyone to contribute.
right. And, we're big. I'm a big Brene Brown fan. You are too, but I'm a bigger Brene Brown fan. And she's a huge proponent of trust doesn't come until there's vulnerability. And in order for us to create a community that has vulnerability, we need to believe as the people posting that we're not going to get slammed by other people in the group. So it is totally a reciprocal thing of like, if we don't if you're not putting that out there and other people aren't putting that out there, then we can all come to the table and feel safe and vulnerable talking about these issues that we all know are tough. So that's where that one comes from.
Yep. And they are going to be tough issues, but value number 2 is be unoffendable. This is one that we really wanted to include in here because so much of shutting down conversations or just the arguing and screaming from the mountaintops that happens with tough issues is because people play the I'm offended card.
Hmm.
I'm offended, therefore I'm right, therefore nothing that you say matters because you upset me, you offended me to my core, and so now I'm just going to be defensive and
Hmm.
shut down this conversation.
Hmm.
And so one of the things that we really want to work hard at is being unoffendable.
Hmm.
That doesn't mean that something's not going to make you upset.
Hmm.
Somebody could say something that you very much disagree with.
Absolutely.
But saying I'm offended and getting defensive and shutting down the conversation is not appropriate for our community and not what we want to do. That doesn't
Hmm.
help our conversation.
Right. Yeah, and it comes back to like what we were talking about earlier with this house analogy is like we and we're going to be working on this together, but I think in order to be successful in this group, you have to have a pretty firm understanding of where you're coming from to begin with and understand that some random person that's in this community that you've never met before might disagree with you, but that doesn't have to change who you are and what you believe. And I think that's a big piece that I see again in just discussions is the fact that somebody disagrees with me rattles me to the core. And so it's going to be work internally to get to the point where that isn't the case, but being able to say I know what I believe and I know why I believe it and I can verbalize it and I can have a conversation with you, but I don't have to justify it to you. And those are different
A
things.
conversation where I'm not trying to make you believe what I believe.
Right. I'm trying to help you
I'm
understand.
trying to help you understand why I believe it.
Yeah.
And that goes into value number 3
Yeah.
very nicely. Press in is that third value.
Hmm.
That goes back to
Yeah.
our Brene Brown love. But anything that requires authenticity and vulnerability can't be done on a surface level.
Hmm.
And so we want to press into these issues. We want to ask questions that some people may be afraid to ask,
Yeah.
and we want to become comfortable with that discomfort of pressing in not only to ourselves to figure out why we believe what we believe and if that's something that we need to hold strong to or not, but we also want to be able to create a culture where people can press into each other and
Hmm.
ask questions of them. But at the same time, we need to be able to ask that same question of ourselves. So it's
Hmm.
both a press in internally
Right.
but pressing into others as well.
Yeah. And kind of relating back to the first one, the Brene Brown quote that we included, we'll post a link to the website with our core values in our show notes. But it's people are hard to hate, close up, move in. And that's one of the kind of foundational pieces that we were thinking about when we created this value. And I think it's so easy to will hate Republicans because of X or hate whatever people group because of Y, or you know there's a ton of examples that you could probably think of just based on that, but and it's really easy for us to hate, or maybe hate's too strong a word, dislike or draw away from people because of that thing about them. But when you press in, when you move in, and when you ask questions and you really get to know people, you find, oh well, they're not exactly like the stereotype because of XYZ. And that's true of every single person that falls into
Right.
one of those groups. And I think that's just something that we're trying to expose and show is um, there might be some true commonalities about big groups of people, but when you get down to them at a personal level, everybody has unique intricacies and everybody has a different perspective or a slight take or a different idea about how these things fit together. And it's only when we can kind of press in and learn and test our assumptions about people that we can start to think of like creative solutions in other ways, or just even other ways of seeing people or groups of people.
Exactly. And creative solutions, you're doing such a good job of leading right into the
Thanks.
next core value. Creative solutions mean exposing false dichotomies, which
Mm-hmm.
is number 4 in our core values. We've
Mm-hmm.
got 5 of them, by the way, so we're almost done. But so much, this goes back to the beginning of our conversation where we were talking about polarizing opinions.
Yeah.
So much of what we do and the discussions, arguments that we have are we pin there's a side A and there's a side B.
Yeah.
You're either for this or you're against this. You're either a Republican, you're a Democrat. You're either conservative or you're liberal.
Mm-hmm.
It's either black or white.
Mm-hmm.
But really, we all know that that's not it. There's so much gray in the middle, and that's where so many of us fall.
Hmm.
Even though if we had to prescribe to that black or white, we would be black or white because you've got half of the spectrum that is more black than it is white in this issue, more red than it is blue. But there's so much gray area in the middle that we want to be able to, as a group, find creative solutions to these problems and find the third option, the fourth option, the 20th option,
Hmm.
because there are so many of us that are living in that gray area that need something to belong to. We can't fully jump on board with this side, but we can't fully jump on board with this side. And so, we're not creating a new political party, or we're not creating a new, you know, response to this issue like nationwide or anything, but just something that we can do to individualize it and not get caught up in the you have to be A or you have to be B.
Right. For all the millennial chick flick lovers out there, it reminds me of the Princess Diaries.
Okay.
No, sorry. It's shoot, now Prince and Me is the name of it. And it's like this whole story about like the prince comes to America and he learns about hard work, and then he comes back to his role as the prince, and he's in this like meeting, and he basically, there's like two sides that are arguing, and they're stuck and whatever, and then at the end they end up coming to this conclusion where they're cutting taxes and that money is going back to the workers, and so they're like they come to a solution. And I think that's just a really silly example, but but I think there a lot of times we see that in our politics today. Well, it has to be X or Y. It has to be abortion or not. It has to be whatever issue you take, and I think it's a way of swinging a big group of people. I mean, they do it on purpose, and I think part of what we want to show is we need to be more educated and bringing more ideas to the table so that we don't fall into that trap from the people above us, and thinking that there's just one way or the other and there aren't alternate ways around. I think too, I've seen a lot of videos on Facebook lately around like alternative uses for like plastic and stuff like that. And I saw this really cool one about like these floating gardens and how they can really help the ecosystem and stuff like that. And it's like I think as Americans, we get into this idea of we have to just wait for the government to fix something. And so, what are they going to do with recycling, and how are we going to solve this problem? But we have more power to shape the future. So, with that, doing
Well,
really
and
well.
she continues. Number 5 on our core values: shape the future.
Shape the present.
Number 5 on our core values: shape the present. Oh,
We
the,
specifically chose shape the present over shape the future.
right. The first line in our description of it is the future is shaped by what we choose today. And so
Mhm.
I do get that mixed up in my mind,
Yeah.
but we did specifically choose to say shape the present and not shape the future.
Yeah, and it comes around this idea of, I think sometimes when we think shape the future, it's too far out, it's too far forward, and we miss opportunities that are right in front of us right now.
It's what our kids are going to do or the next generation is
Right.
going to do, setting them up for success rather than
Yeah.
making ourselves successful.
Right. How do we use plastic bottles as floating gardens or whatever the case may be? And I think even just like I'm getting into issues a little bit, but there's this whole, I'm sure you've all seen kind of all the stuff around straws lately and
Mhm.
how much of a big issue or
Plastic straws are at
yeah,
Starbucks.
plastic straws are just, we are creating a ton of waste with plastic straws. And
Mhm.
so, you can, like, there are things you can choose to do personally. Like, if you're going to be sitting at a restaurant, do you really need to have a straw? And I think sometimes we feel like that's just such a small thing. But, how many straws do I use in a year? Like, it's a lot of straws. And so I'm just making a conscious effort to, not use a straw if I don't need a straw. And it's one step. And for me, that comes from, I'm learning about myself as a person. I'm not a cold turkey person. I'm gluten free for like a year now, and that for me was not I couldn't do it quickly. I had to slowly make choices, and I think sometimes we get so overwhelmed by this idea of like I have to be gluten free or not gluten free. There's
Mhm.
no in between. And so that idea of like, how do I take these small steps so that I can move towards where I want to be? And so that obviously those are both silly examples of what we're talking about. But But I think that kind of shows what we're talking about. Like, you have the power to make little choices along the way.
And we don't want this to stop at conversation. That's
Right.
the biggest
Right.
part of this whole thing is these conversations are healthy between Brittany and I, between our friends and I, between your friends and family and you. Hopefully the conversations we'll get into on Facebook, but we don't want it to just be a group of conversation that leads to nothing.
Yeah.
That doesn't serve any purpose. So we want there to be action, and so this shape the present core value hopefully will motivate us to make some action, and whether it's having another conversation with a coworker or a friend or family member, or something as little as trying to use fewer straws, whatever the step is, hopefully we can come up with that in each episode of our podcast and encourage people to take an action or give them a couple options, give you guys a couple of options. But we want there to be action, whether it's small action, and hopefully a bunch of small actions can lead to big change, so we're not waiting on other people
Yeah.
to fix our problems.
And part of that's going to be too, we've always wanted and hoped that that, like you mentioned, you take that conversation, but that would almost be kind of a core step, would that be that rather than coming to the internet in our group first, that you'll take that conversation or the ideas that come out of the podcast and take that to somebody in your real personal life, and somebody that you feel like you have that vulnerability and connection with, and then be able to take a little bit wiser, better position to the Facebook group and bring that to the table.
So those are our 5 core values for the podcast and for our community. So you can check all those out, renovationtheory.com. And then if you go to renovationtheory.com/core values, core-values, you can see those there. Read through them and read our descriptions. And if that's something that you can get on board with, we would love to have you involved. We've started a Facebook group, and that is surprisingly called Renovation Theory. So just search for Renovation Theory on Facebook, and then you can join our group. And then at the end of every episode, what we want to do...
Pause before you do that. We wanted to just quick mention our next episode.
Oh yeah, so this is like the intro. This is not really specific as far as what we're going to be, how the rest of the episodes are going to be structured. This is just an overview of what's going to happen. But our first real episode, our episode number 2 next week, will be...
Yeah, so my college journalism professor recently passed away, and at his funeral people were talking a lot about
he was talking at his own funeral.
Not him, sorry. People were talking about how he was just this great person at exposing biases and asking really good questions, and kind of digging deeper into the matter. And it kind of got us thinking about how much we might not realize how small our box can be sometimes, and how much bias we actually bring to conversations, into life. And so both of us are in the media field, so there'll be a little bit of conversation around how that comes into play, and how we can kind of expose different ways that we might be kind of living inside a little bit of a bubble that we don't realize.
Yeah, that's a big thing. I mean, the bias isn't really a bias if you know about it, and it's just an opinion that you have. So that's next episode. But one thing we want to do at the end of every episode, in kind of that journalism sense, and just that asking questions, that conversation, is we want to leave with a question. And that's a question that we'll post on the Facebook group so that you can hopefully answer and join in that conversation. But it's also just something where if you're just listening to the podcast or just watching the podcast, that you can think about. It's like it's the one step that we want people to take and think about, have conversations about. So our first question is pretty broad, but it goes at the core of why we're creating this group. And it's just, what do you think the biggest barrier in having good quality, honest conversations around culture and society today, whether that's online or whether that's in person? But what are the biggest barriers that you see? And then hopefully throughout the life of this podcast, we can look at those and we can address those.
Yeah, and along with that, we'd love if you have any feedback or questions on like the core values or what we're doing or what our plan is or any of that. We would love to talk to you about that. We want to really be open to any of those conversations. This isn't, the whole point is community, and so that means we invite you into the process.
Yep. So feel free to subscribe to our podcast.
Please.
If you're on iTunes or whatever, it's not iTunes anymore, it's Apple Podcasts.
Oh.
If you're using Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever, we'd love for you to subscribe, and we'll get you a new episode whenever they come out. Weekly, hopefully, is the plan. And then if you like what you see, then please join our Facebook group and join in the conversation, and we will see you next week.
Thanks, everybody.